Hello everybody, you're listening to the Polymath radio show with your host, Daniel Aaron Levy. As always, it is a pleasure to be here, and just in case you're new to the show, just to introduce this, it's an educational show, it's unscripted, it's off the cuff, and it's just based on my prior knowledge, and it's conversational as well. I want it to feel like I'm kind of there in person, talking to you, yapping in your ear. Now, this episode today is the Science of Attractiveness. Why do we find certain features attractive? And just to say, with this kind of thing, with the Science of Attractiveness, we're going to be using evolutionary psychology quite promptly to figure this out. A disclaimer on how evolutionary psychology should be used. It's not meant to say, this is attractive, this is unattractive. It's not meant to prescribe rules and laws about attractiveness. It's really just meant to explain trends which are already there and which we already notice. And I'm going to be elaborating more on that as the episode goes on. I just want to make that clear. With that said, let's get into it. So attractiveness, of course, is a combination of biological and cultural factors. You know, the classic debate of nature versus nurture. And, I mean, this is evidenced by the fact that we get a huge range of beauty standards all across the world. And even in the same place, according to different times or in different subcultures in the same time and place, beauty standards vary quite wildly. They also vary massively between individuals in the same cultural context. Clearly, it's not just about biology, but there are some constants, and importantly, there are some trends as well. And it's when we analyze these, and when we apply the logic of evolutionary psychology to explaining these trends and constants, that we can begin to see some kind of evidence for a biological basis of this. Although, of course, this is very subjective. Attractiveness is very subjective. It's very individual. Any postulations of the science of attractiveness are necessarily going to be it's really about averages and trends. It's not about individuals. So let's say, the science of attractiveness, we can explain with evolutionary psychology why a lot of people find small noses attractive. That doesn't mean if you have a small nose, you're automatically going to be attractive. That doesn't mean if you don't have a small nose, you're automatically unattractive. It's not really a good idea to apply something like evolutionary psychology, which is kind of built to explain trends in populations and large numbers of people and kind of generalities and general averages. It's not good science to apply that to an individual, but that doesn't mean it's not without value. In fact, it's quite the opposite, and I really hope to demonstrate that to you guys at the end of this. Not that this is just going to be about evolutionary psychology and biology. We're going to be talking about the cultural side as well, but it gives insights to the cultural side if we start with the biological side. So let's just take a moment to explain what evolutionary psychology actually is, because I've been using this term a lot. Evolutionary psychology is using the logic of evolution and natural selection to explain why humans think the way that we do. Why is it that the human condition is what it is? Why is it that our minds work in a certain way? And why is it that by extension, with our minds working in a certain way, and human nature being what it is, why is it that we've created the societies and the worlds around us? And I think evolutionary psychology is such an amazing, valuable tool. I actually think it's the best way that we have to kind of explain why our experience of life is the way it is. And I mean, different cultures, of course, use different kind of disciplines and academic fields to explain that. I mean, I think the biggest one that people have used historically is theology. People have turned to religion to explain why the world is the way it is and why humans are the way they are. But I think from a scientific perspective, I mean, I am an atheist, which I think is an important thing to say here, but I think from a scientific perspective, I think evolutionary psychology is the key to it. And we're going to be using evolutionary psychology here, although we're going to be using other disciplines as well, maybe some anthropology, a little bit of politics, a bit of sociology, but evolutionary psychology is the key. So natural selection, the only aim of natural selection is to transmit your genes to the next generation and to do so as efficiently as possible. That is the key. That's all natural selection does. By definition, right? Because that's just how the process works. That's really, really important to understand about natural selection. It's not designed to make humans intelligent or loving or happy or strong. It's just designed to make them transmit their genes. Now, an important thing to understand about natural selection is that the products of natural selection aren't individual, open brackets, fitness maximizers. People aren't consciously thinking, how do I maximize my reproductive fitness? What can I do for this? What can I do for that? They are adaptation executors. This is to say, natural selection has given people the emotional and psychological tools for natural selection, but we aren't really conscious of it. I mean, unless you learn about it, you're not self-aware of it. You just sort of follow these mechanisms. So, for example, the emotions of attraction, the emotions of lust, the emotion of love, all these are tools employed by natural selection to encourage you to transmit your genes to the next generation in some way and to kind of allow that transfer to take place. But we're not conscious of that. We don't fall in love with someone and we think, yes, this will be beneficial to me because it will mean that I stick with a partner of mine and therefore increase the chances of having healthy offspring, and I nurture my offspring and therefore increase the likelihood that that offspring survives to the next generation and is able to propagate their genes. You'd have to be a bit of a weirdo to be thinking that. The point is we unconsciously execute the adaptations that natural selections have given us. Sometimes these adaptations can get used in the wrong way. For example, when we get attracted to people who we know are bad for us. The point is that adaptations are quite general tools to help us propagate their genes. They don't work perfectly in every scenario, but we've been given them because generally throughout the course of history, they've been more useful than not in helping us propagate our genes. Now, a key thing to understand is that men and women pass down their genes in very different ways due to biology. And it's really important here to make the distinction between sex and gender, because they're kind of like the biological and sociological variants of a same, or like a general phenomenon. Sex is the chromosomes that you have in your cells, XY, XX, or if you're intersex, some kind of like a difference. If your cells aren't all XX or XY, then that falls under this umbrella term known as intersex, where you don't kind of slot neatly into one of those categories. Technically, actually, in the animal kingdom, the definition of sex isn't the chromosomes you have in the cells. It's whether the gamete you produce is big or small. The gamete that women produce is eggs, and they're big. They're actually the biggest cell in the human body. So an egg cell is about the size of a small full stop. Now you can see it with the naked eye. Men are defined as producing a small gamete, i.e. a sperm cell, which is way, way smaller than an egg. That's the technical definition of sex. But I think for humans, we can understand it as the chromosomes in your cells. Gender is how you choose to identify. It is the identity that you choose to adopt both for yourself and that you choose to present to the world. And for most of the time, i.e. for people who are cisgender, that gender aligns with their biological sex. But there can be differences, because gender isn't just the chromosomes that you have in your cells. It's how you act. There are differences, and these differences are diminishing now in certain regions, but in the vast majority of human history, and for the vast majority of places now, the gender that you identify as carries this huge social weight of how you choose to speak, what you choose to wear, how you interact with people, how other people treat you, how other people perceive you, even the kind of life that you live, the kind of lifestyle that you live. Gender is the kind of social manifestation of a biological phenomenon, which is sex. But gender is a social phenomenon. It's very important to understand that. Gender is inspired by biology, i.e. generally it's rooted in sex, it's influenced by sex, but they're not identical, and gender is not in itself a biological phenomenon. So when it comes to evolutionary psychology, we're going to be talking about sex here, because that is the biological phenomenon. Now, when we think about how men and women reproduce, the reproductive investment for men is infinitely lower than that of women. Having sex, having an orgasm, and then you're done. As a man, that's your work done. You're chilling. So as a result, men can kind of sire huge numbers of kids. The person who is known to have the largest number of kids, some horrifically violent and bloodthirsty Moroccan king or prince or whatever, called Moulay Ismail, had over 800 children. For women, however, the parental investment is much, much higher, because you actually have to carry that kid to term. You have to give birth to that kid. That kid's being carried in your belly for 9 months, and then you got to incarnate that. So this kind of gives rise to very, very key differences in how natural selection works and the kind of adaptations that it's given the two sexes. So for men, because the investment in reproduction is so low, in order to propagate your genes to the next generation as much as possible, the focus is on quantity, not on quality. Obviously, as a man, men are attracted to some people and not to other people, because selectiveness does exist for men, but it's much lower than that of women. And the evidence for that is, it's both anecdotal and scientific. Anecdotally, it's pretty much universal that it's men who tend to be more kind of focused with going out and meeting women. And when it comes to dating, it's usually the men pursuing the women, and it's classically men who, this stereotype is that men will go out and try and pursue as many different women as possible. And that is a stereotype, of course, but it is rooted in a biological reality. Not that that biological reality is fate, not that we have to do the things which natural selection deems an efficient strategy, but the reason why that stereotype has been so prominent through history is because it does have a biological rooting. And this has been proven scientifically, actually. So there was this study where a group of men would approach women on campus and just ask them, would you like to go on a date with me tonight, or would you like to go to bed with me tonight? And most women, as you may expect, said no to would you like to go to bed with me tonight. And most didn't say yes to would you like to go on a date with me tonight, but it was a higher percentage. But when women went on a college campus and asked men the same question, the overwhelming majority of men said yes to would you like to go to bed with me tonight. And of course, we've noticed that in culture there is like a general greater willingness of men to have sex than women. This isn't revolutionary news. It's something we see in our culture all the time. But men are still selective. It's not as if men will just sleep with anybody, even if the threshold for sex and reproductive efforts, we could say in quote marks, for men tends to be much lower. For men, and remember, natural selection only cares about propagating genes to the next generation. So when we're analyzing the mechanisms of natural selection, we're keeping that in mind. For men, if the aim of natural selection is just to propagate your genes to the next generation, what you're going to be looking for is signs of fertility, i.e. signs that the partner that you choose is going to actually be able to carry your child, give birth to the child, and be able to raise like a healthy offspring. Just to make clear, this is an unconscious process. No, you'd have to be an absolute freak to be thinking to yourself, yes, that woman looks very fertile, I'm going to sleep with her. That's really weird. The point that I'm making is that the kind of things that the average man stereotypically may find attractive based on natural selection, and of course it's not just based on natural selection, it's also based on individual preference and the culture the individual is in. That's really important to bear in mind. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that the perceptions of attractiveness are ultimately, biologically, rooted in fertility. And I'm going to explain that. Basically, as women get older, they get less fertile. Men also get less fertile as they get less older, but to a lesser extent. So, for example, a 50-year-old man may still be able to sire children. A 50-year-old woman very likely won't be able to. So there is a real kind of age, there's a real relevance of age in fertility for women, which means that the stereotypical biological trend of male attractiveness is on youthful, or to use the scientific term, neotenous appearance. It also prioritizes looks above all else, because if the reproductive strategy of men is quantity, not quality, it doesn't make sense from a natural selection perspective to be invested in the personality traits and the social status of your partner. What makes sense is to be invested in the fertility of your partner. It makes sense to look for someone who's fertile so they can propagate your genes, not someone who may not be super fertile but has a great personality and who will definitely raise your children, because you're a man. The role that natural selection has prescribed is one where you can get away with low parental investment. And again, another disclaimer, in human beings, it's actually not usually what happens. Usually parents do invest a lot in raising their children. But the point is that's not necessary from an evolutionary perspective. It's very useful. I mean, that's the reason why that's evolved in the first place. The reason why men in human societies often do spend a huge amount of effort in raising children is because it greatly increases the likelihood of them reaching adulthood and therefore kind of passing on your genes. But in order to just reproduce, all that's actually necessary as a man is to find a partner who's minimally fertile enough to carry that child to term, which means that men stereotypically tend to focus on looks more than personality, because looks, i.e. the attractiveness, the appearance of the woman, is your brain's best guide to assessing the fertility of a woman. And by the way, this is all subconscious. You are not looking at a woman and thinking, yes, I can gauge based on this woman's kind of outward appearance that this person is highly fertile. It's not. Your brain just uses the appearance of a woman as a shorthand to figure out, to kind of make a snap judgment on the fertility of that woman. So, because obviously in some animals, when women are at their fertile phase in their kind of menstrual cycle, i.e. when they're ovulating, the animal changes their appearance. Humans don't do that. women do not look different based on what their stage in the menstrual cycle is. So your brain doesn't have an obvious marker of fertility. So to make a kind of snap judgment on how fertile a woman is, it looks at her appearance, which kind of makes sense. And signs of neoteny, or a youthful appearance that indicate fertility, i.e. that your subconscious sees, the male subconscious sees as a snap way of assessing fertility, which are generally found attractive, are large eyes, bigger eyes, a smaller nose, softer skin, luscious hair, longer and thicker eyelashes. It also goes some way to explain the prevalence of blonde hair, because when people are born, they tend to have blonder hair. People's hair tends to get darker as they grow up. So blonde hair is a feature which you kind of subconsciously associate with youth, which is why blonde hair, well, it's potentially a reason why blonde hair has been found so stereotypically attractive, because it's an outward sign of neoteny, or youth. It also goes to explain why the stereotype of blonde hair is more of a thing for women than for men, because the male beauty standard isn't really based around youth as such. Now, it's really, really important to say that these are just evolutionary psychology explanations for pre-existing beauty trends. We cannot use evolutionary psychology or this kind of logic to say, yes, blonde hair will always be attractive, or blonde hair will always be unattractive, or blonde hair will only be attractive as long as a woman has a youthful appearance, or blonde hair won't be attractive if a woman doesn't have a youthful appearance. These are theories. Evolutionary psychology is about theories. It's about explaining the human condition using biological language and using the language of science and the scientific method. It is not about prescribing laws of attractiveness. And of course, not all cultures have these beauty standards, because attractiveness is also really dependent on cultural standards as well. I'm just trying to indicate how biological trends and a kind of desire for fertility and passing on your genes, and how that's reflected in outward appearance, can be used to kind of gain some insight on why things may be found biologically attractive. But this isn't all. As a man, when assessing the fertility of a woman, I shouldn't really say as a man, because as a man, if you're constantly assessing the fertility of a woman, you're an absolute weirdo. I mean, with a brain and psyche engendered by the male sex. That's what I mean. With a subconscious engendered by the male sex. Signs of neoteny aren't all that you're looking for fertility. You're also looking for what we call secondary sexual characteristics. What does that mean? You're looking for just good genes in general, because human beings accrue genetic mutations in lots of different ways, including during the process of cell division for reproduction itself. So the cell division process is meiosis, which you may remember from biology GCSE. It's basically just how sex cells are made in the human body. That can lead to mutations. Whilst humans are alive, they can accrue mutations just through background radiation, just in the environment around them. The point is that you're looking for genes that are good in the sense that they lead to fertility. By the way, another key disclaimer. We should not be getting our social values from natural selection. The idea of good genes makes sense in a natural selection context. It does not make sense in a moral context. Eugenics is a morally bankrupt doctrine that doesn't make any sense from a scientific perspective. Or at least even if there are some scientific arguments for eugenics that aren't overtly idiotic, the point is we should not be basing our moral standards and our social values on them. Just to make that clear. Anyway, so you're looking for genes that are conducive to fertility, but you can't assess someone's genotype just by looking at them. What you can do, however, is assess their phenotype, i.e. their outward appearance, because the outward appearance of someone is going to be based on the genes that they have. And the way that human beings tend to assess the phenotype of someone, to assess the quality of their genes, i.e. their genetic fitness, i.e. their ability to kind of sire offspring, is by looking for secondary sexual characteristics. And the secondary sexual characteristics are the kind of visual changes, the changes in someone's outward appearance that come with puberty. Because puberty, and by the way, this applies to both men and women. We're just talking about male evolutionary psychology for now, though. Secondary sexual characteristics are a result of puberty. So, for example, in women, the secondary sexual characteristics are kind of gaining a larger bust, wider hips, also body hair as well. For men, some examples would be a wider jaw, larger muscles, body hair as well, etc., etc., larger genitals as well for men. The point is, these are just the visual changes in the body produced by puberty. And the reason why it's important is because puberty is such a massively complex process. It requires so many genes to work correctly that by assessing the kind of assessing the ability of an individual's genes to do that, i.e. to produce secondary sexual characteristics, you get a good idea of their genetic fitness. So remember, and also, we don't just use secondary sexual characteristics to approximate genetic fitness, also things like symmetry, so facial symmetry, having good bodily proportions, having healthy skin, having no kind of obvious diseases, even people's posture, the way they carry themselves, and movement, the way they move, are all things that are implicated in attractiveness because they are outward signs of genetic fitness. And these aren't necessarily secondary sexual characteristics. They're just part of the same idea of using someone's outward traits to assess their genotype. Now, it would make sense. Now, the kind of point I'm going to make here is that while secondary sexual characteristics tend to be important in attractiveness, it does raise the question of body hair, because body hair is characteristically seen as unattractive on women and acceptable for men. But body hair is a secondary sexual characteristic for both sexes. And it's likely that the reason why body hair is is paradoxically seen as unattractive on women is dependent on obviously cultural factors and beauty standards. It may also be dependent on biology, however, because even though both sexes develop body hair during puberty, the increase in body hair is much more significant for men. So it's a trait associated with masculinity and virility, i.e. it's more associated with male puberty than female puberty because it's more characteristic of male puberty. And if body hair is a trait associated with male puberty and testosterone and male kind of masculinity and virility, it makes sense that biologically that would be seen to be unattractive on a woman. But a reminder, this isn't ironclad or set in stone. So for example, a deep voice, while it is a masculine trait and is a product of male puberty, can also be attractive on a woman. And of course, all of this depends on individual preference and the culture that people are immersed in. So it's also worth saying that for men, because the male subconscious is assessing for fertility, what you want is a woman who has been through puberty, but is still fertile, which means that we have this combination of youthful appearance and neoteny, but also secondary sexual characteristics, i.e. clear signs that someone has gone through puberty. So just to be clear, something like pedophilia, i.e. the attraction to children, is not biologically normal. Not only is it morally suspect, to say the least, we are not endorsing pedophilia on this radio show, it also doesn't even make sense from a biological natural selection process, sort of perspective, because children, having not gone through puberty, are not fertile. But it means that in men you have this, what at first might seem paradoxical, coexistence of biological beauty imperatives, where we're talking about youthful appearance and neoteny, and we're also talking about secondary sexual characteristics, but it makes sense that we have men have both of these kind of biological imperatives, because you're trying to find that golden mean where women are fertile, i.e. they've gone through puberty, but they're still young. It's also worth saying that men still do care about personality and the actual personality traits of a woman. I did say before that the minimum investment of men to have a child is simply to sleep with someone and then leave. And that is true, but it's often not what happens in human cultures, because it actually increases your likelihood of having a child massively if you actually raise that child. Which is why even in hunter-gatherer societies, men still do have quite a large amount of parental investment into their children. You even see it in some apes. So, for example, gorilla males will help raise their young as well, because that increases their chance of transmitting their traits to the next generation. And obviously, if you're going to be raising a child with a partner, the personality of the partner is still relevant. Men do still care about personality when it comes to the attractiveness of a woman. Obviously, clearly. I mean, that is quite obvious. And also the emotion of love, which helps to bind parents to each other and therefore provide a better environment for raising a child, and also helps to bind parents to children in order to help raise that child and give parents the emotional incentive to raise that child. So just as an aside, love therefore evolved as a process of natural selection to help transmit genes. Even something like love is clearly very dependent on the personality of who you're falling in love with. Like, you're not really going to fall in love with someone you hate, right? So personality is still relevant here, just not to the same extent as it is for women in perceiving attractiveness. And this is borne out by anecdotal and societal evidence. Men generally are more willing to invest in sex, to engage in sex and to pursue women. And, are more willing to do that and are generally a little bit less, they place less emphasis on the personality of the woman to do so. The exception, actually, is in species where the male gets pregnant. For example, some species of birds and in seahorses, where instead of men competing to attract the attention of women, it's actually women who compete to attract the attention of men. Because men have a much larger investment in reproduction, so they're more reluctant to engage in reproduction, and the personality and the kind of behavior of their partner is more important. Hence why women compete with women in these species, because men are less likely to engage in reproduction than women, so women are more eager for it and have to pursue the men, and hence why they compete with each other to do so. And then in the opposite, where, for example, in vast majority of species and in human species, women are the ones getting pregnant and therefore investing far more energy into reproduction, it tends to be men competing for women or competing to attract women. This is borne out, by the way, in sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism is the phenomenon that in the same species, men and women are of a different size. And the reason why this has evolved, the reason why men are larger than women in so many species, is because men compete with other men to reproduce with women. Because the reproductive costs for women are much, much higher, so they're more reluctant to do it. So therefore, it's men competing with each other to do it. And so there is this kind of competition in animal species to do so. This is why testosterone as a hormone has evolved. It's a competition hormone. Like, all the actions of testosterone, the physical kind of consequence of testosterone and the behavioral consequence of testosterone are to optimize males for competing with other males to gain access to women. In, of course, the species where women are sort of bear children and therefore it's men competing for women. This, I don't want to go on a massive sidetrack about the actions of testosterone, but you can see this in the fact that testosterone kind of spurs men to grow taller and more muscly and stronger, and also spurs them to become more competitive and aggressive and much more mindful of social status and dominance. Because it's a competition hormone. It's optimized to make men compete. So now let's turn to women and the kind of female subconsciousness and female standards of beauty and the kind of biological explanations for these. Women are fundamentally different because their investment in reproduction is much, much higher. It's not just about sex. You have to actually raise that baby for 9 fucking months and then give birth to it. So obviously as a woman, you're also trying to transmit your genes to the next generation. Again, this is subconscious. You are not consciously thinking as a woman, I need to transmit my genes to the next generation. You would have to be a massive weirdo. But the point is that biological imperative is there. So, like men, women seek kind of physical attractiveness because it's a shorthand sign of assessing someone's genotype, but they also need male parental investment. Because as a woman, when you're pregnant, you're extremely vulnerable. I mean, think about humans evolved as hunter-gatherers. If you're a lone pregnant woman on like the savannah and the African plains, you're probably gonna die. Like, you need someone to stick around and help you. So you need male parental investment, i.e. you need a male to help support you while you're pregnant, support you while you're a mother, and also to help raise the kid. Which is why women pay a much higher attention to personality and behavior in attractiveness, because it's not just because it's important to gauge whether that partner is suitable. For women, it's not just primarily about fertility and attractiveness. It's about finding someone who's actually going to stick around. Now, women can and do have casual sex, not just in the West. It's just something that women can do. Again, evolutionary psychology is not meant to prescribe laws. It's not here to say women can only have sex with people where they want a partnership, or women will only have sex in order to start a family. That's not true at all. Clearly that's not true because experience shows us that that isn't true. Evolutionary psychology is not meant to contradict our experience. It's meant to explain it. But generally, women are less willing to engage in casual sex than men and do so less often. And generally when selecting partners, women tend to go for quality over quantity. Unlike men, women generally, on average, don't want to sleep with huge numbers of partners. Some do. And it's wrong to make a moral judgment about that. And it's also not scientifically valid to make a moral judgment about that. But it's more likely that women won't want to do that and will be more choosing with their partners and more kind of focusing on quality. Now, the quality of a partner as a woman is both physical and social. Women also do still need to look for fertile partners in order to be able to kind of pass their genes on to the next generation. But because male fertility doesn't decline with age as much, when it comes to female standards of physical attractiveness, it's not really based on a youthful appearance as such. It's just stuff like general phenotypic indications of genetic fitness. So, for example, symmetry, good body proportions, good skin health, etc. And also secondary sexual male characteristics, i.e. the visual changes that tend to come on with puberty and tend to be caused by the actions of hormones such as testosterone. So, for example, a strong jaw, larger muscles, potentially facial hair. Studies have shown that on average, light amounts of facial hair, so i.e. kind of stubble or heavy stubble, tend to be perceived as more attractive than people who are clean shaven. Again, this is a tendency at an average. It doesn't apply to everyone, and it's dependent on culture as well as biology. But it is still a phenomenon that exists. Also, tends to be like narrower, hooded, what's known in incel circles, admittedly, on the internet as hunter eyes. Testosterone tends to kind of produce more narrower, deep-set eyes rather than bulging, kind of large, fish-like eyes. Not to insult the latter kind of eyes, I'm just trying to paint a vivid picture for you. And that's because that's one of the actions of testosterone. That's also why, fun fact, in a lot of dating apps, in the pictures that men use, they will try and squint their eyes a little bit, because that appearance of narrower eyes is a secondary sexual characteristic, and it's seen as more attractive. Again, most men don't do this because they understand the evolutionary psychology behind it. They just know that it makes them look more attractive, or they perceive that it makes them more attractive. Also, secondary sexual characteristics: increased height, which makes sense. Women tend to like taller men, and a high kind of shoulder to waist ratio. So large shoulders, narrow waist. The converse for women and female attractiveness is like a waist to hips ratio. So like a narrower waist and broader hips. Because broader hips is like a female secondary sexual characteristic. But it's not just about physical attractiveness when it comes to male beauty. Women put a large emphasis on the personality of a man and also the social status of a man. And social status kind of can be thought of how cool a man is. It's kind of like the respect and esteem that a person has. And evolutionary social status is really important because in hunter-gatherer tribes that we all evolved in, and which therefore our attractiveness mechanisms are fine-tuned to, the higher someone's social status, the better their access to food and resources, the better their ability to raise offspring. So as a woman, it makes sense that you'd put a priority on social status when it comes to choosing a mate, and therefore determining someone's attractiveness, because that determines how well a man is going to be able to raise offspring. So the concept of social status is very, very important for attractiveness. In practice, what gives people social status varies enormously. Like what makes people cool is pretty much entirely dependent, not entirely, but largely dependent on cultural norms, kind of the specific subculture someone is in, and also individual opinion. Social status is a very flexible concept. It's acquired in very different ways in different cultures. I mean, for example, in ancient Roman times, social status as a man was acquired by being a fearsome warrior. In medieval Christian monasteries, it's acquired by being pious and gentle. In the Yanomamo hunter-gatherer tribe of South America, it's acquired by hunting jaguars. In Bristol, it's acquired by dressing in a certain way and listening to certain kinds of music and acting in a certain kind of way, etc. Social status is very, very flexible. What is biologically determined, however, is a female preference for social status. And that makes sense. I mean, we see this. You can see that women tend to be attracted to cooler people and tend not to be attracted to people who aren't cool, or who are, you could describe in a pejorative way, as a bit of a loser. This also explains the universal male obsession with gaining social status. Women also try and gain social status and try and be seen as respected and esteemed. That's a normal human phenomenon. Everyone tries to gain social status. But with men, the competition for social status is particularly acute. And you kind of see this in the fact that men tend to have a larger ego. They tend to be more competitive. They tend to be more aggressive. They tend to place more cultural stock, historically at least, on honor and reputation and what people think of them, and not being seen as a coward and not being seen as unmanly, because from a male perspective, social status is much, much more important because it affects your reproductive success, i.e. the likelihood that women will pursue you, to a much, much greater extent. And the reason why male cultures are classically obsessed with masculinity. And this is something that in modern progressive Western circles is starting to fade. But for the vast majority of human history, and for the vast majority of humans now, masculinity is still really, really important for men because it's intimately tied with social status, i.e. with how they are perceived by other men and, in many of these cultures, by women as well. So social status is really, really important for attractiveness. And again, in our culture, we can contextualize the quest for social status as the idea of being seen as cool or respected or gaining respect. You see this classically in films. Whenever some mob boss says, I was about to do the Italian American accent. I don't know that I have that facility. I don't know that I have the facility to do that. I'm going to abstain from that. But whenever you see Godfathers being like, talking about respect and being respected, that is the ancestral male drive for social status. And that has evolved to a greater extent in men than women because women tend to prioritize social status in reproduction and kind of attractiveness more than men do. Now, it's rare, however, for men to have both high social status, i.e. to be cool and attractive and athletic, and suitable parental characteristics, i.e. to be nurturing and gentle and sweet. And it's not impossible. There are many men like that, but it's rare. And I'm sure many women can attest that that is very rare. Hence the classic kind of longing and the duality in like the stereotypical media for women longing for both bad boys and good guys. Bad boys being someone with a high social status, which is perceived as attractive, and good guys, which is someone who has good, suitable personality traits for parental investment in raising a child, which is also seen as attractive. But there's this kind of latent conflict where people can pursue bad boys and pursue people who they know aren't good for them because they find them attractive, because these men have a high social status and physical attractiveness. But because these men don't have suitable nurturing characteristics, it can often be quite like a maladaptive choice. This is what I said earlier with how a natural selection can sometimes lead people to make very bad decisions. I'm sure there are lots of women who are in relationships with people or are pursuing people who aren't good people, who they know are bad for them, but who they find very attractive nonetheless due to having high social status and physical attractiveness. Now, something very, very important. The role of social status in attractiveness helps shape a lot of cultural beauty standards as well. Now, here's the thing. The cultural component of attractiveness, the kind of beauty standards that are prevalent in every time and place, is very, very multifaceted. It varies massively on loads and loads of different factors. And obviously, it's not just about social status. But when I said earlier that conceptualizing that once we understand the biological side of attractiveness, it can shed some light on cultural attractiveness as well, the cultural side of attractiveness as well. What I meant was that social status is often a very, very important mediator of what's seen as culturally attractive. So, for example, paler skin in Victorian era was seen as more attractive because it denoted a higher social status, i.e. denoted an aristocrat or a gentleman who didn't have to engage in manual labor and therefore didn't acquire tan skin. Nowadays, however, tan skin is often seen more attractive in Western cultures because it connotes higher social status, i.e. the ability to go on frequent holidays and travel to lots of places and lounge outdoors in the sun and sunbathe, rather than being cooped up inside an office or a factory for some reason. The point is that this trend has changed in part due to changes in how social status is acquired in Western societies. It's also in modern East Asian cultures, for example in South Korea or Japan or China, it also explains a preference for paler skin there, because in East Asian cultures, paler skin is still associated with absence of having to do manual labor and therefore social status. And actually you see loads of skin whitening and bleaching kind of products, skin products in East Asian cultures because of this. It's the kind of idea of social status and attractiveness also explains the constant association between movie stars and the kind of trends of celebrities and what beauty standards conform to. So, for example, a lot of what explains variations in female beauty standards throughout the 20th century kind of applies to what female movie stars or models or just generally kind of influential celebrities, what kind of beauty shape, what kind of body shape and facial features they had at the time. It also explains why historically beauty standards have depended hugely in a country on what the monarch of that country is doing and the way that the monarch chooses to dress. Because the way that a monarch chooses to dress, say in 17th century absolutist France, let's say Louis XIV decides to wear I don't know, a giraffe onesie, which obviously is impossible. But just imagine it. Just imagine the Sun King wearing a giraffe onesie. Because it's the King of France, one of the most powerful people in Europe, that giraffe onesie is going to become associated with social status. Hence, a giraffe onesie percolates throughout the population as people try to imitate it because it's seen as attractive. And it's seen as attractive because it's associated with social status, which people may not always be conscious of, although in a lot of the cases people are conscious of this. People will deliberately dress in a certain way because they want to be seen as cool, i.e. because they want to have social status. That was a really massive run-on sentence, and I've forgotten the original root of that sentence, but I think I've made my point. The point is that social status often determines beauty trends, and we see this modern day in Hollywood, for example. A more insidious manifestation of the link between social status and attractiveness is in groups of power and influence influencing beauty standards. And we see this in the process of colonialism. Now, I don't want to talk hugely about colonialism because it's just one kind of manifestation of how culture can affect beauty standards, but it is undoubtedly a real phenomenon, and it's something that we have to talk about. So, for example, you particularly see that in ex-colonial societies, for example, South Indian and Philippine societies, i.e. with a long kind of colonial history, we see very prevalent beauty standards conforming to kind of Western or European facial features and also lots of skin whitening products. The skin whitening thing is also admittedly associated with like manual labor and being able to stay inside. But there is that Western influence as well. You also see this in the Middle East. So, for example, I'm Iranian, right? My mum's side is from Iran. And there's a really classic joke in Iran that every woman, as soon as she comes 18, gets a nose job. Because the ethnic kind of nose shape of Iranians tends to be a hooked, convex nose. However, Western beauty standards have become very, very prevalent. And the beauty standard that is kind of percolated to Iran is a concave nose, i.e. a nose that slopes inwards. Hence, this is anecdotal, by the way. This isn't scientific. But the point is, it's a recognized and often joked about phenomenon in Iran, for example, but also the Middle East in general, that people are getting nose surgeries in order to conform to Western beauty standards. And that's important as well, because actually most people, most ethnic groups, tend to display a preference for their own kind of ethnic group when it comes to attractiveness. Most ethnic groups tend to prize features of that ethnic group. You especially see this with like hunter-gatherer societies, for example. So, for example, when white colonists reached the Trobriand Islands, they noticed that the islanders didn't conform to Western beauty standards at all, and their beauty standards were based on Trobriander ethnic features, for example, wide hips and larger amounts of body fat, to the bewilderment of Western colonists who had completely different beauty standards. You also see this in modern dating sites, so online dating sites in Western countries, where people tend to some extent to favor their ethnic group. But, and this leads us back to the colonialism thing and the group of people in power, that people on online dating tend to overwhelmingly favor white people in Western countries, even when these people are not white. They also tend to overwhelmingly disfavor black people. This process also occurs in Japan and Taiwan. So clearly, like beauty standards are influenced both by perceptions of power and social status, which we particularly see in the percolation of Western standards, and they're also influenced by people having a slight ingrained tendency to pursue their own ethnic group. And I'm aware that that is a contradiction, but there necessarily has to be some kind of contradiction here, because the cultural standards of beauty are so complex and it's so multifaceted. And I think to me it makes complete sense that an online dating, white people tend to get favored and black people tend to get disfavored, but also kind of in real life, people tend to be attracted to features of their own ethnic group. And I mean, you tend to see this especially when that kind of doesn't conflict with Western beauty standards. So, for example, in Europe, for example, it may be that people in Mediterranean countries tend to favor kind of olive or slightly darker skin, and it may well be that people in Northern European countries tend to favor lighter or whiter skin. That would be an idea of people kind of favoring the features of their ethnic group without violating conventional Western beauty standards. Because in Western beauty standards, there is some slight wiggle room. There is some slight variation permitted, which allows people to pursue features of which allows people to kind of pursue ethnic traits, kind of ethnic phenotypic traits that are specific to their ethnic group. And, so there's a lot of beauty standards in cultures, race aside. And by the way, just to kind of say, there's a difference between ethnicity and race. Again, just as we were talking about sex and gender earlier, and how sex is like this kind of biological phenomenon, and gender is the social manifestation of that phenomenon, ethnicity is a biological phenomenon and gives rise to different ethnic features. Race is the social and political consequences of ethnicity. And I know it might sound a little bit ridiculous for me to tell you that race is a social phenomenon, because you might be thinking, no, race is race. People are the skin color they are. But let me explain that. Would you say, for example, that Irish people are of a white race? You probably would, right? You'd say Irish people are white because you look at Irish people and you see that they are white. However, in the late 1800s, Irish people were not seen as white. Italians were not seen as white. Spaniards were not seen as white. Eastern Europeans were not seen as white. The only peoples that were seen as white in the late 1800s were people like Anglo-Saxons, Northern Europeans, Germans, and kind of people of Germanic descent, and maybe Frenchmen. Because the idea of race, the idea of being white, wasn't an ethnic phenomenon, it was a socio-political phenomenon. The idea to be white in that area was to be superior. It was to be better. This is not to say that that is actually true, by the way. That needs to be said. Racism is wrong. Obviously. The point is, in an era dominated by racism, and specifically dominated in an era where countries which happen to be of Germanic descent, for example, England, the USA, and Germany, were dominant in the globe, the kind of political psychology that fostered was this belief in the innate superiority of Germanic races, which were given the moniker of being white, which became a shorthand not for ethnic description really, but for social and biological superiority. Hence, Irish people were not considered white because they weren't seen to be socially superior in that same way. And that's just one example. But the point that I'm trying to make is that race is not a biological phenomenon. It is a social phenomenon that exists in the minds of people. Ethnicity is a biological phenomenon. Even if you were completely ignorant of it, ethnicity would still exist because different ethnic groups experience different traits. And it also so happens, as I said, that people in ethnic group X will tend to gravitate towards the ethnic traits typical for their own ethnic group, i.e. ethnic group X. But again, these are trends. And race and ethnicity aside, there are lots and lots of reasons why beauty standards in culture shift and change and vary. There's lots of variations in cultural beauty standards. But that variation tends to occur within biologically sensible limits. So, for example, symmetry. All cultures tend to prize facial symmetry, which makes sense. Almost pretty much all cultures historically for men have prioritized being muscular or being tall, which makes sense. We even see this in something like body weight. Now, the phenomenon of very skinny women is actually largely a 20th century Western aberration and is quite unusual because curvy types have been idealized for most of human history and in most societies. And in fact, we see this even kind of in... There's this famous statue called Venus of Willendorf. You guys have probably seen it, even if you don't know the name. It's like this kind of Bronze Age, like small statuette, and it famously depicts a very curvy woman with quite a high body fat percentage. And the point is that the kind of curvier types, or types with a larger body fat percentage, have often been more popular than the hyper skinny women that we associate with 20th century Western beauty standards. And from a biological perspective, this makes sense, because actually body fat is healthy, of course, to an extent, and is a marker of fertility, i.e. of being well nourished and of being healthy. It's also, body fat percentage historically has also been a sign of social status, because for most of human history, where societies have been built on a narrow elite oppressing and exploiting the hell out of everyone else beneath them, which sounds like quite a politically charged statement. However, it's really, unfortunately, it's not. It is just the way human societies have tended to be structures, and we're going to be exploring more of that in other episodes, by the way. But this is a psychology episode, not an anthropology episode. But in those kinds of societies, the vast majority of people have been fairly malnourished. You can actually see this if you look at the graves and kind of skeletons of people from pre-modern societies, where aristocrats will almost always be taller and have thicker bones and generally healthier skeletons than commoners, because the idea is that commoners were malnourished to some extent, and were also unable to accrue reserves of body fat due to food scarcity, which means that in pre-modern societies, having a larger amount of body fat has been often seen as more attractive because it connotes social status. And as I said, that's seen as more attractive. And, I mean, potentially, that change in the 20th century, the reason why skinnier women tend to be idealized in the 20th century, was due to the raised living standards for the vast majority of people, and therefore the separation of body fat position from social status. In fact, in modern society, we see the inverse correlation. So people with a higher socioeconomic status tend to be, on average, slimmer, because actually, cheap food tends to be quite shitty food for you. And also exercise and having a healthy diet and having the motivation to do all those things depends on having the resources to do that. So for example, if you're like a wage slave working huge hours for barely any money, you're not going to have the time, the money, and the energy to like go to the gym every day and eat healthy, especially if you're living before like the New Deal era in the 1930s. Let's say you're some like American worker working 12 hours a day in a factory where your arm could be cut off by a machine every second, and where every time you go on strike, your boss hires a bounty hunter to shoot at you. That's not an exaggeration, by the way. That really happened in Gilded Age America. Let's say you're in that situation, you're not going to be eating healthy. You know what I mean? Which may be some explanation why skinniness in the 20th century tended to be seen as more attractive. But that's obviously the rise of skinny beauty standards in Western society in the 20th century is going to have lots of different reasons. The point is that generally beauty standards tend to kind of remain within biologically set limits. So for example, with body fat, for example, beauty standards generally don't kind of value women who are greatly obese to the point of being unhealthy. They generally don't value women. I say value women. I don't mean to say that we should be valuing women based on whether they conform to beauty standards. I just mean that beauty standards are in themselves quite ruthless and often ascribe value according to being able to meet those beauty standards. But it's rare that beauty standards will value women who are either clearly overweight to an unhealthy degree or clearly underweight to a healthy degree. And there are exceptions to this. For example, the heroin chic of a few decades ago. That is famously a kind of beauty standard which prioritizes underweight women. But even then, the idea of heroin chic, I mean, while that was very prevalent on the media, and while that is extraordinarily important and is proof that actually cultural beauty standards can be, the cultural kind of determinants of beauty standards can be very powerful and can even perhaps overwhelm, but kind of override biological imperatives, it seems that most people looking back on heroin chic certainly condemn it and see it as unattractive. And it's also likely that in that era, the actual beauty standards of the average person on the street wasn't calibrated to heroin chic. I don't know that for sure, but I think it's likely. It's just important. I just want to illustrate the possibility of beauty standards kind of seen in high media being different from beauty standards held amongst the general population. While beauty standards of the general population do generally tend to are heavily influenced by the media they consume and the high social status figures in their life, i.e. celebrities, they're not always exactly identical. That's just the point that I'm trying to make here. And whether that may sound like a contradiction, but it's not a contradiction, it's nuance, because it's just a very complex subject, and I just feel the need to cover all bases and nuances here. So in short, attractiveness is due to a very complex mix of biological and socio-cultural factors, and even, as we discussed, in political factors. So when it comes to the kind of nature versus nurture debates of what we find attractive, it is, as always in these debates, a little bit of both. I hope that's been useful for you. If you hear those papers rustling in the background, those are just some bullet points that I've written down. As I said, this was unscripted, it's off the cuff, it's based on my own knowledge. I haven't revised this beforehand or anything. I sincerely hope you found that useful. If you've listened, even to just a few seconds of this, certainly if you've listened all this way, I'm genuinely honored and flattered. It genuinely really means a lot to me. And I hope you have a lovely day. Take care. Goodbye.